The fertile terrain of today's mission felt like a strange dream. The dry, desolate lands we usually marched through had been replaced by vibrant greenery, and the locals here moved with a wary nonchalance. The Taliban's grip on the region was tight, and the fear they instilled in these people was as palpable as the dust in the air. "Doc. Over here." Ahmed's cheerful voice cut through the tension. He was always upbeat, always positive, even in a country where optimism seemed as rare as clean water. "What's up, Ahmad?" I asked, falling into step behind him. "I'm good, Doc," he beamed. "There's a villager who needs help. Follow me." Without waiting for a response, he turned on his heels and began walking away, the small crowd around us barely noticing. We approached an elderly man sitting on the ground, his white beard nearly touching his lap. His weathered eyes studied me cautiously, sizing me up like I was the enemy. "I will tell him you are the doctor, and you can help," Ahmad translated with a nod. I slung my rifle over my back and nodded. Ahmad spoke rapidly to the man, who seemed to understand but didn't look reassured. When Ahmad came back, his face wore a mix of confusion and concern. "He says his chest hurts, his breath is heavy," he said, his voice low. I asked Ahmad to translate, tell him I need to examine him. After a quick check, I found that the man's breathing was shallow, his chest rising and falling in strained rhythm. His foot, however, told a worse story, an infected wound that needed immediate attention. The infection was bad, and I explained, as best as I could through Ahmad, that it needed cleaning. It would hurt, but it was the only option. The man recoiled, clearly afraid. "He thinks you're going to hurt him," Ahmad said, frustration creeping into his voice. "The Taliban has been telling them that we poison and kill." I sighed. There was nothing I could say to change his mind. It wasn't the first time I'd run into this, and it wouldn't be the last. I gave the man one last look before turning back to my squad. We moved out, the village growing quieter the farther we went. The crops in the fields had been flooded, the muddy ground making it impossible to use the vehicles. So we walked, mud up to our ankles, with Ahmad tagging along, as usual. Ahmad was one of the few local interpreters who worked with us. A member of the Afghan security forces, he'd joined to help the Americans, even if it meant putting his life in danger. His family was in the same precarious position, living in a small town under constant threat from the Taliban. But the paycheck mattered to him more than anything, even if the price of his safety was his soul. We hit the village after a short walk, and it was eerily still. There were no locals walking around, and most of the buildings had been gutted. A ghost town in the making. "What the hell is this?" Frodo asked, his voice thick with disbelief. Ahmad explained quietly, "When the Taliban come, they say to leave or die. So they leave, or they die." I shook my head. "Why would they do that?" "To set you up, of course." Ahmad smirked in a way that only someone who had seen the worst of humanity could. And then, just like that, the calm shattered. "Mortars!" Red shouted as the first round hit. We scrambled for cover, diving into nearby huts. "I told you, Doctor." Ahmad cried, a nervous laugh in his voice as he knelt beside Ortiz and me. "Yeah, no shit," I shouted back as the second blast followed closely behind. The world around us blurred in a dust-filled haze. We huddled in the remains of what had once been someone's home. It was surreal, a place where families had once shared meals, now reduced to a shelter for soldiers caught in the crossfire. And then the enemy struck, their fire coming from the ridge to the north. "We've got to move." Ortiz barked, his voice cutting through the chaos. We dashed from one broken-down building to another, each step feeling like it might be our last. Gunfire rang out, and I felt the pressure build in my chest as my heart raced. "They're coming!" Red yelled from across the courtyard. "North! On the ridge! Hold tight!" I shouted, my hand on Ortiz's shoulder. We huddled in what had once been a bedroom, now just another box of death. The rest of the squad began to return fire, and I scanned the room for any signs of the enemy. That's when Ahmed's voice crackled in my ear. "They're moving," he said urgently. I peeked through a crack in the wall, spotting a few insurgents sprinting toward us. One of them carried an RPG across his shoulders. "Get ready," Ortiz muttered, and before I could blink, his rifle was in action. The insurgents scrambled for cover behind rocks. "Incoming!" Ortiz shouted a split second before a rocket tore through the air. The blast hit our shelter with a deafening crash, throwing us all to the ground in a cloud of dust and debris. I struggled to recover, my head pounding from the impact. "Everyone okay?" I shouted. Ahmad gave me a thumbs up, but Ortiz was already moving. We followed, running into another structure, when a voice cried out from a nearby house. "Medic!" I broke into a sprint, the world around me a blur as bullets flew by. Inside the next hut, I found a soldier, Specialist Paul Pulaski, from 1st Platoon, bleeding out from a neck wound. "Wake up!" I slapped his face, trying to rouse him. Blood poured from the wound, but his jugular was still intact. It was bad, but not fatal, at least not yet. "Get him up, Doc," someone shouted. I barely noticed who called out. My mind was already running through treatment plans, grabbing my medical bag and prepping for a quick evac. And then, in the chaos, the worst happened. Ahmad had sprinted ahead of me, and I saw him take a hit, directly through his Kevlar vest. He flew back with a sickening thud, his body slamming into the ground. I was at his side in seconds, dragging him out of the open. "Ahmad!" I screamed, heart pounding in my chest. "Doc, very painful," he groaned, grimacing as I tried to assess the damage. I tore his vest off. The bullet had ripped through his side, missing his organs by inches. I reached for the syringe, ready to numb the pain, but Ahmad pushed it away. "No! Bandage me! We must work!" He was insane. But there was no time to argue. I patched him up the best I could, and somehow, he managed to stand. "Your friend is hurt, let us go," he shouted, forcing himself to his feet as if he hadn't just taken a bullet to the gut. "Crazy son of a bitch," I muttered under my breath, but I followed him anyway. Inside the house, a few soldiers from Killer Squad were slumped against the wall, with one of them still returning fire. Ahmad collapsed beside one of them and motioned weakly to me. "Doc!" "Here he is," he said, his voice strained. I knelt beside the soldier, checking his vitals, weak pulse, labored breathing, and blood pooling around his body. He'd been hit in the shoulder, so I ripped off his sleeve to expose the wound. It was bad, real bad. I patched it up as best as I could and shook him gently. "Hey, wake up!" I shouted. "Incoming!" Another soldier screamed just as I heard the thump of a rocket slamming into the wall. Ahmad threw himself on top of me as the rocket detonated outside. The house wall crumbled slightly, but we were protected, at least for now. The injured soldier groaned, his eyelids fluttering. Thank God, he was still alive. "Ahmad, you okay?" I asked, standing up. He managed to pull himself to his feet, pain radiating across his face. "I cannot let the doc die," he said through gritted teeth. His bandages were soaked through with blood. "Damn it, Ahmad," I muttered, redressing his wounds. "Stop doing this shit to me." "Do not worry about Ahmad," he insisted, swatting me away like I was overreacting. "Your friends, they are your concern." As Bang Bang and Devil arrived, things seemed to settle. The enemy was quickly routed, and we regrouped in the village. Ahmad stayed close, standing beside me during the debrief. "Ahmad, you sure you're alright?" I asked again. His face was pale, but his smile never wavered. "Oh, Ahmad is strong. "No bullet stops me," he boasted before his legs buckled beneath him. Red and I caught him, helping him back up. "Goddamn, Ahmad, you're one crazy son of a bitch," Red muttered, shaking his head. "You Americans are not all bad, no? The Taliban?" Ahmad's voice was filled with conviction. "No, Americans help." Our platoon sergeant approached as we made our way to the Humvee carrying 1st Platoon. "What the hell happened to him?" he asked, motioning to Ahmad. "He was playing medic with me," I replied, giving a half-smile. No. Ahmad is just translator. You are document. You keep your job," Ahmad said, grinning through the pain. We all chuckled, the tension easing. As we climbed into the Humvee, I pulled my PSG aside. Ahmad warned us of the ambush. He helped me get through it. He's crazy, but not a coward. He nodded, his face serious. Good. Because I heard that Alpha had a translator who was a Taliban informant. Almost got them killed before they figured it out. I instinctively glanced over at Ahmad, who met my eyes and waved cheerily. "I don't know," I said, a strange gut feeling settling in. "Something tells me he's one of the good ones." Ahmad was taken to the hospital for treatment. I didn't agree with him coming back so soon, but he was stubborn. "I must return to my people, document. They need me," he insisted. His injuries still weren't fully healed, but he refused to rest. He always insisted on joining us when he could, always cheerful, always helping. Maybe that's what I needed, his unshakable optimism. It was contagious. I once gave him one of my old medic bags, patched up and filled with bandages. I'd written, "Approved by Lifeline," on it in Sharpie. Ahmad was ecstatic, carrying it everywhere, even using it once to help patch up a soldier during a firefight. One of my favorite memories was sharing a meal with him. I handed him his favorite emery, the lasagna. "One day, I'll take my family to America and visit the doc," he said, grinning wide. I laughed. "I'd love to have you over." "You are a great healer," he said, his eyes sparkling. "Not just of bodies, but of souls. You fix the broken things of the body and soul." "Just doing my job, Ahmad," I said, but he shook his head. "We are called to greater things than jobs, document. Your calling, it is here, with these soldiers, with your friends. These people need you. The Taliban are no good, maybe America is no good, but you? You are good." He threw me a thumbs up. We high-fived, laughing together. Ahmad's dream was simple: move to America, start a new life, and give his children the opportunities he never had. He wanted to show the world how beautiful Afghanistan really was. And he always had that damn smile on his face, even in the darkest times. But that dream was cut short. Ahmad was killed in an IED ambush while patrolling with 3rd Platoon. When I heard the news, I asked about casualties. The answer was short: just Ahmad. The moment he died, the attackers withdrew, like it was all planned. It made my blood run cold. He knew the risks, but he kept helping. He believed, maybe naively, that he could change things, make the locals see the truth about us. I kept a Polaroid of Ahmad with me, alongside the others we'd lost. He wasn't a soldier. He wasn't even supposed to be in harm's way. He was just a man who wanted to help his people. And now, his story was over. Ahmad was one of the good ones. And I'll never forget him. The days following Ahmad's death were a blur, like the world had shifted into slow motion, each moment feeling as if it carried the weight of 1,000. Every time I reached for my vest, I expected to feel the comforting weight of that Polaroid of Ahmad in my pocket. But now it was just a hollow reminder of someone I couldn't save. The outpost felt quieter without him, and the usual banter between the guys seemed more distant, like there was a gap in the air that no one could fill. The team was still working, still moving through the motions of the war, but something was missing. It wasn't the same without Ahmed's unwavering optimism, his ridiculous jokes, and his constant refusal to back down from anything, no matter how dangerous. He had been a beacon for us, an unexpected light in a place so filled with darkness that it often felt like we'd never see the sun again. I found myself replaying that last conversation we'd had over and over in my mind. "You fix the broken things of the body and soul," he'd said. And I couldn't shake the feeling that I had failed him. What had I done to save him? Nothing. I had watched him die, just like I'd watched so many others die before him. I could heal the body, but I couldn't protect the soul. The worst part was that I couldn't even grieve properly. Not in this place. There was no time for mourning, no time for remembrance. It was always about the next mission, the next engagement, the next firefight. The clock kept ticking, and we had to keep moving. It was a week before I even had a moment to sit down and reflect. We had just wrapped up a firefight near the edge of a small town in the mountains. Another ambush, another day at war. Our casualties were light, but that didn't make the situation any better. I was used to death, used to blood and gore. But with Ahmad, it was different. He wasn't just another casualty. He had been a part of the team. More than that, he had been a friend. As I sat on the edge of the Humvee, staring out into the distance, I found myself wondering about the future. What would happen after all of this was over? Would it even end? Would we ever get to go home, to see our families, to put all this behind us? Or would we be stuck, forever in this cycle of violence, where death was just another part of the job? "Doc," Red's voice broke through my thoughts. "You good?" I turned to see him standing nearby, a cigarette dangling from his lips. He didn't look like he was in much better shape than I was. Red had always been one of those guys who had a way of keeping things together, but lately, I could see the cracks in his armor. "Yeah, just thinking," I replied, trying to sound casual. I didn't want to burden him with my thoughts. We had enough to deal with already. "About Ahmad?" Red asked, sitting down beside me without hesitation. I didn't even have to answer. He knew. "Yeah," I said, voice thick with emotion. He was something else, man. I never met anyone like him." Red nodded. "Yeah, he was a hell of a guy. I've never seen someone so willing to put himself out there, to fight for something bigger than himself. He was the kind of guy who made you want to be better." "I just keep thinking," I continued, my voice growing quieter, "maybe if I'd done something different, maybe if I'd insisted that he rest, or—" "Don't do that to yourself, Doc," Red cut me off. "He made his choices, just like we all do. And he didn't regret it. Hell, he'd probably be pissed off if he knew you were blaming yourself." I laughed bitterly. "Yeah, he probably would. He was stubborn as hell." "That's the thing about Ahmad," Red said, taking a long drag from his cigarette. "He wasn't afraid of anything. He didn't see the world the way the rest of us did. He believed in people. Even when everything around him was falling apart, he still believed. That's the kind of guy he was." I stayed quiet for a moment, staring off into the distance. Red was right. Ahmad had never been afraid. Not of the Taliban, not of death, not of anything. He had always believed that he could make a difference, that by helping us, he could change things. Maybe he was naive, but that didn't make him any less brave. He had been a warrior in his own way, fighting not with weapons, but with hope. It was then that I realized something important. Ahmad hadn't died in vain. He had made a difference. Not just to us, not just to me, but to the people around him. His dream of showing the world the beauty of Afghanistan, of changing hearts and minds, was still alive. It wasn't over. It couldn't be. I glanced at Red, who was still quietly smoking his cigarette. "You're right," I said, my voice firmer now. "He didn't die for nothing. We have to keep going. We can't let his story end here. Red looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. That's the spirit, document. We keep fighting. For him. For all of us. The conversation ended there, but something in me shifted. I wasn't sure what the future held, but I knew that I couldn't let Ahmed's death be the end of everything he had stood for. His dream had to live on, even if I was the only one left to carry it. The days dragged on, each one a blur of missions, firefights, and constant tension. But through it all, I kept thinking about Ahmed. Every time I faced a choice, every time I wondered if what we were doing was worth it, I thought about him. About the way he had believed in people, in something bigger than himself. I wasn't sure I had that same belief, but I could try. I could honor his memory by doing the best I could, by making sure that his sacrifice wasn't forgotten. It wasn't much, but it was something. A few weeks later, we were once again preparing for another mission. This one was different, though. It felt heavier, more dangerous. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to go wrong. It was a feeling I'd gotten used to over the years, a sixth sense that came with surviving long enough to know when things were about to turn south. As we geared up, I noticed that the guys were all a little quieter than usual. Even Cartel, usually the loudest of the bunch, was uncharacteristically silent. It was as if we were all waiting for something we couldn't quite name. I slipped my Polaroid of Ahmed back into my pocket, alongside the others who had fallen before him. I didn't need to look at it to remember him. His memory had already etched itself into my soul, and it would stay with me for as long as I drew breath. Lifeline, I muttered under my breath, gripping the edge of my rifle. Let's make this one count. The mission came without warning, like most of the operations we ran. We were briefed quickly in a small, dimly lit room in the back of the outpost. A simple assignment: move out, check the nearby village for Taliban activity, and neutralize any threats. Standard stuff. But there was something about it that felt different this time. Maybe it was the quiet tension hanging in the air, or maybe it was the fact that we'd all felt a little bit like we were marching toward our own funerals, but this mission had an ominous weight to it. By now, we had gotten used to the grind. The hours of waiting, the adrenaline of the firefights, the constant awareness that death could be waiting around any corner. It had become a part of who we were. But after losing Ahmed, we'd all begun to question why we were still here. Was it for honor? For duty? For vengeance? Maybe it didn't matter anymore. We kept moving forward, not because we had answers, but because we had no other choice. I did a quick check of my gear. My rifle was in perfect condition, my medical kit organized and ready for whatever came our way. Red was at my side, as usual, giving me a knowing glance as I tightened my straps. "You ready for this, Doc?" Red asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Am I ever?" I replied, a small smirk tugging at the corners of my mouth. I wasn't sure if I was trying to reassure him or myself. Cartel and Specs were already in position, checking their equipment and giving each other the occasional nod. Frodo was off to the side, talking with the Afghan interpreter, who was doing his best to keep things light despite the tension. Sarge stood near the front, eyes scanning the room, as usual, always thinking 3 steps ahead. "We hit the road in 5, Sarge said, his voice low and authoritative. "We know the area. We've got air support if needed, and we've got our orders. Stick to the plan, no heroics. No heroics." It had become Sarge's mantra. Not that any of us were particularly inclined to try and be heroes, but war had a way of changing people. Some of the guys were itching for action, for a chance to strike back at the people who had been picking us off from the shadows. Others just wanted to survive, to make it out of here in one piece. As we moved out, the air felt heavy, thick with the promise of violence. The Humvees rumbled along the dusty roads, kicking up clouds of dirt in our wake. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows over the barren landscape. The mountains loomed in the distance, silent and unyielding, like a reminder of everything we had lost and everything we still had to fight for. We made our way toward the village, our convoy moving steadily through the desolate streets. There were no signs of life, no children playing in the dirt, no farmers working the fields. Just the occasional glance from behind closed doors, wary eyes watching us as we passed. We had been here before, in this kind of ghost town, nothing more than a shell of what it once was. "Stay sharp," Sarge muttered as we neared the outskirts. "Intel says they've been using this village to move weapons. We need to find out where they're hidden." I nodded, my grip tightening on the rifle. The silence was oppressive. You could feel it in the air, the sense that something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and for a moment, I thought I saw movement in one of the windows. But when I turned to look, it was gone. We advanced cautiously, moving from building to building, clearing rooms and making sure there were no hidden threats. The village felt abandoned, and yet every step felt like we were being watched. "That's odd," Cartel muttered, breaking the silence. "It's too quiet." Sarge nodded, his face grim. "Could be a trap. Or they've already moved out." I glanced over at Red, who gave me a quick look. His expression mirrored my own unease. We had been here long enough to know that nothing was ever as it seemed. We reached the center of the village, and that's when it happened. The explosion hit us without warning. The ground shook beneath us, sending a cloud of dirt and debris into the air. The shockwave knocked me off my feet, and I heard the sound of metal grinding against stone as the Humvees were thrown sideways. My heart skipped a beat, and adrenaline flooded my veins. I scrambled to my feet, immediately reaching for my radio. "Lifeline, report." I shouted into the mic, but there was only static in return. "Doc." Red's voice cut through the chaos, and I turned just in time to see him pull himself from the wreckage, covered in dust but otherwise okay. "We're taking fire. Move, move." We dove into cover as the sound of gunfire rang out, sharp and deadly. They were waiting for us. The Taliban had set up a trap, and now they were unleashing everything they had. The bullets whizzed by, kicking up dust as they splintered against the stone walls around us. I took a deep breath, my medic instincts kicking in despite the chaos. "Cartel, Frodo, cover me." I shouted, already moving toward the downed Humvee where Specs was slumped over. I could see blood soaking through his uniform. Not good. Red was right beside me as we sprinted to his side, pulling him out of the line of fire. His eyes were wide with panic, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Specs!" I shouted, my hands already working to stop the bleeding. "Stay with me, man." He was barely conscious, his face pale, but his eyes flickered toward me. I'm sorry, Doc," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the roar of gunfire. "I'm not going to make it." "Don't talk like that." I snapped, trying to maintain control. My hands were shaking as I worked to patch him up, but the blood was pouring faster than I could stop it. I needed more time, and we didn't have it. "Get him out of here." Red shouted, dragging me back to cover as another round of fire exploded against the wall behind us. I barely noticed the shrapnel embedded in my arm until I felt the sting, but it didn't matter. I had to save Specs. He was one of us, part of the lifeline we had built. "We're not leaving him." I yelled over the chaos. "We get him out, or none of us make it back." But as I looked around, I realized how outgunned we were. There were too many of them, and we were too exposed. The village had become a killing field, and we were the prey. My thoughts raced as I realized the weight of the situation. "Doc." Red's voice cut through my thoughts again. "We need to fall back." I turned to see him signaling to Sarge, who had managed to regroup with the rest of the team. The Humvees were useless now, and the village was too dangerous to stay in. We needed to get out before we were all surrounded. But I couldn't leave. Not without Specs. We're not leaving anyone behind. I shouted again, gritting my teeth. That's when the sky lit up, and the roar of a jet engine pierced the air. The cavalry had arrived. Our air support had just entered the fight, and the sound of their bombs hitting the ground sent shockwaves through the village, followed by the unmistakable thunder of machine gun fire as they strafed the positions. "Move, Doc!" Red shouted, grabbing me by the arm. "We've got to go." For a moment, I hesitated. I wanted to fight, to save Specs, but the reality of the situation hit me like a ton of bricks. We were outnumbered, outgunned, and the only thing we had going for us was time. If we didn't leave now, none of us were going to make it out. And so we ran. I glanced back one last time, seeing the air support turning the tide of the fight. The Taliban forces were scattering, their positions crumbling under the weight of the aerial assault. But it didn't matter. Specs was gone.